The year is 1861, a year that tore America apart. But in a quiet town in rural Pennsylvania, far from the booming cannons of the Civil War, a different horror unfolded, one hidden not on the battlefield, but beneath the ground. They said the Copeland family was cursed, that death came early to their children, and that the local undertaker had grown rich burying their bloodline. But what no one dared to whisper was this. One son, Frederick Copeland, had not truly been dead when the coffin was sealed. The gravedigger spoke of faint sounds, the scratching of fingernails on wood, the muffled voice of a boy begging to be let out. But the priest silenced him, declaring it the tricks of the devil, the restless spirit of an unrepentant child. When the grave was reopened days later, the coffin lid bore deep claw marks from the inside. Frederick's body was twisted, his mouth frozen in a scream that had never been heard. His brother, the one who signed the burial papers, claimed he could still hear Frederick's voice in his sleep. And in the decades that followed, the townsfolk came to believe something darker, that Frederick had never left, that his spirit remained, clawing, not at wood now, but at memory, at history itself. This is the forgotten story of the Copeland brothers, a tale of betrayal, of buried secrets, and of a church willing to cover up horrors no scripture could cleanse. The Copeland family had lived in Lancaster County since the early 1700s. Respected merchants by trade, they carried themselves with the dignity of the devout. Their estate loomed over the town like a stone sentinel, its windows black, its halls filled with whispers of infant coffins and midnight funerals. People spoke of their misfortune as if it were inherited. For children died before the age of 10, their tiny gravestones standing in perfect symmetry behind the family chapel. But there were rumors, dark ones, that not all these deaths were natural. Neighbors claimed they saw the Copeland patriarch, Isaac Copeland, conducting late-night rituals in the cellar. Women spoke of hearing hymns twisted into chants, prayers curdled into something pagan. Children dared one another to approach the estate gates, swearing they could hear cries echoing from underground. By 1861, only 2 sons remained, Frederick, the younger, and Samuel, the elder. Frederick was fragile, pale, and often ill. Samuel, by contrast, was strong, calculating, and deeply favored by their father. It was Samuel who insisted on Frederick's burial. Even as whispers spread that the boy's skin was warm, his lips still flushed with blood. The family physician raised doubts, but Samuel silenced him with money, power, and a warning. To the town, it was just another Copeland tragedy. To those who knew better, it was the beginning of something much worse. Frederick Copeland had been buried alive, and Samuel had made sure of it. Religion was supposed to bring comfort, but in this town, the church only deepened the unease. The pastor who presided over Frederick's funeral, Reverend Josiah Brandt, was no ordinary man of God. He was stern, his sermons heavy with fire and fear, and his doctrine was whispered to hold more than scripture. Witnesses claimed the Reverend refused to touch Frederick's body before burial, offering no prayer over the boy's form. When asked why, Brandt muttered, "He breathes not the breath of God." During the funeral, the congregation noticed strange details. The candles flickered despite the still air. The church bell tolled without a hand upon the rope. And when the coffin was lowered, some swore they saw the earth itself tremble. Afterward, the Reverend gave strict orders. The grave was never to be reopened, and the family was not to speak Frederick's name again. Those who questioned him were met with threats of excommunication, whispers of damnation, and reminders that faith demanded obedience. But even as the church silenced the town, the grave did not stay quiet. Gravediggers told of noises beneath the soil, and in the dark hours of the night, the Copeland estate lit its chapel candles, always facing the graveyard. The silence of the church was not protection. It was collusion. After Frederick's burial, Samuel Copeland grew strangely calm. Neighbors who had known him as arrogant and temperamental now saw a man withdrawn, his eyes fixed on things others could not see. He stopped attending Sunday services. He stopped eating at the family table. At night, servants claimed they heard Samuel pacing his chamber, muttering under his breath, pausing only to scratch at the walls as though trying to carve something into the plaster. One maid swore she heard him whisper, "I can still hear him, beneath me." But when confronted, Samuel denied everything. He told the townsfolk his brother had been weak of constitution, weak of spirit, and unworthy of inheritance. The truth, however, was darker. Samuel had not only signed the burial papers, he had forced the physician to declare Frederick dead. Why? Because Frederick, not Samuel, had been chosen by Isaac Copeland to inherit the family estate. It was ambition, not grief, that buried Frederick alive. And yet, Samuel could not silence the consequences. At night, he claimed he saw fingers protruding from the floorboards, pale and clawing. He claimed Frederick sat in the pews of the family chapel, head tilted, lips parted as though he were about to speak. The house itself seemed to tighten around Samuel. The windows rattled without wind. Mirrors cracked without cause. His father would not acknowledge it, and the church forbade mention of it. But Samuel knew the truth. He had not buried his brother's body. He had buried his brother's voice. The local undertaker, Elias Dorn, had handled many Copeland burials over the years. He was a practical man, hardened by death, immune to superstition. Yet Frederick's funeral lingered in his thoughts like rot that would not wash away. Elias later confessed, in a letter discovered decades afterward, that Frederick's skin was warm when he touched it. Not the warmth of decay, but of a living boy. He had noticed faint moisture on Frederick's lips, the slight flutter of his eyelids. Elias had tried to delay the burial, but Samuel stood over him, pistol at his side, ordering the coffin sealed. That night, Elias could not sleep. He claimed he awoke to the sound of pounding, dull, distant, rhythmic. When he stepped outside, he realized it came from the cemetery. Elias did not act. Fear of Samuel's wrath and of Reverend Brandt's authority kept him still. By dawn, the pounding had stopped. When the grave was later reopened, on Samuel's orders, to silence rumors, Elias nearly fainted. The coffin lid was splintered from within, streaked with blood and flesh. Frederick's fingernails were torn away. His face bore the blue-black mask of suffocation, his jaw unhinged in an eternal scream. Samuel declared it proof of restless demons. Reverend Brandt called it a warning to the faithless. But Elias knew what he had seen. He knew that Frederick had been alive, and he knew he had done nothing. That silence would damn him until his own burial. The grave was not reopened once. It was reopened 3 times. The first was Samuel's cruel spectacle, staged to quiet gossip. The second was less public. Local children, daring each other in the moonlight, had dug into the earth until they struck the coffin lid. What they claimed to see spread through town like a fever, that Frederick's body was not rotting, but changing. His skin was white as chalk, his hair still growing, his eyes open, staring. By the third reopening, ordered by Reverend Brandt himself, fear had poisoned the entire community. The Reverend declared that Frederick was unnatural, that his soul had been barred from heaven, trapped between life and death. He ordered a ritual of salt and fire. The body was to be bound, sprinkled with holy water, and sealed once more beneath consecrated ground. But the ritual did not work. Weeks later, townsfolk claimed they saw a pale figure walking near the Copeland estate at dusk, barefoot, his clothing tattered, his eyes vacant. Dogs barked and refused to cross the road near the cemetery. Livestock grew restless. Whether it was ghost, revenant, or the tortured projection of a guilty conscience, no one could say. But Samuel began to unravel completely. He locked himself in the estate's highest room, scratching words into the walls until his fingers bled. The words, preserved even today in fragments of plaster, read, "Frederick will not forgive me." By the winter of 1861, the Copeland estate had become a house of horrors. Servants fled. Neighbors crossed the street rather than meet Samuel's eyes. And Isaac Copeland, once the proud patriarch, retreated into silence, refusing visitors, his health rapidly declining. Samuel's paranoia grew unbearable. He insisted that Frederick was not only alive but inside the house. He claimed to hear scratching beneath the floorboards, soft crying from the walls, the sound of breath in the darkness of his bedchamber. In desperation, he turned to Reverend Brandt. The Reverend prescribed not prayer, but secrecy. He forbade Samuel from speaking of Frederick, warning that acknowledgement fed the devil. Instead, Samuel was told to atone, to fast, to bleed himself, to pray in solitude until his body weakened and his mind bent toward obedience. Samuel obeyed, but his visions only grew worse. He began to see Frederick not as a boy, but as something else, his face bloated, his jaw stretched open, his eyes clouded with soil and blood. In his journal, later discovered in the ruins of the estate, Samuel wrote, "I feel him beneath me, clawing upward. Every night, closer. Every night, louder. I fear the day he reaches the surface, for it will not be my brother who comes, but the thing I made him." Soon after, Isaac Copeland was found dead in his study, cause unknown. Some said Samuel murdered him. Others whispered Frederick had claimed his first victim. The Copeland name, once powerful, now meant only one thing: terror. After Isaac's sudden death, Samuel sought solace in the only institution still willing to tolerate him: the local orphanage, funded in part by Copeland wealth. But the children feared him. They whispered that when Samuel entered the chapel, the candles went out on their own. They claimed he brought with him a smell like damp soil and rotting flowers. One girl said she saw a pale hand resting on Samuel's shoulder as he prayed, a hand that vanished when she blinked. Caretakers, desperate to keep order, warned the children to stay silent. They threatened punishment for blasphemous stories. But the children spoke anyway, late at night, huddled under thin blankets. They swore that Frederick's voice sometimes joined their lullabies, whispering from the rafters, singing hymns in reverse. The matron, Agatha Price, reported these disturbances to Reverend Brant. His answer was chilling: "Do not speak the boy's name. He is no longer boy nor man, but a vessel of corruption. His presence feeds on your fear." Soon, the orphanage itself became infected with dread. Cribs shook, Bibles were found shredded, and the children swore that in the chapel mirror they could see Frederick standing behind them, his mouth moving soundlessly. It was as if the burial had not contained him at all, but released him into every place the church controlled. And now, the orphans themselves were beginning to dream of the grave. When the Copeland estate was searched decades later, investigators found documents hidden beneath floorboards in the East Wing. These papers, now known as the Copeland Papers, revealed details that the church had long suppressed. Frederick, it seemed, had not been sickly by chance. Samuel had been poisoning him slowly, grinding toxic herbs into his meals, draining his strength so he appeared weaker than he truly was. Isaac, blinded by favoritism, never saw the manipulation. By the time Frederick collapsed, his body was frail, his breath shallow, easy to mistake for death. The papers also contained notes in Isaac's own hand, detailing experiments in the family cellar. He described attempts to preserve bodies, rituals blending scripture with alchemy. Isaac believed he could hold death at bay, that Copeland's could conquer the grave itself. Frederick had been his intended heir to that secret knowledge. Samuel, discovering this, acted swiftly. He could not allow Frederick to inherit both wealth and forbidden wisdom. His betrayal was not simply fratricide, it was a theft of power. But in burying his brother alive, Samuel had triggered something his father never intended: a corruption not of science, but of soul. The final paper, smeared with dried blood, bore only a single line: "He scratches still." By 1862, Lancaster was no longer the quiet town it had been. The Civil War raged across the nation, but here, the battle was against something unseen. Cattle were found dead in their fields, their eyes missing. Wells turned foul overnight, water thick with mud and hair. Children disappeared, at first one, then three, then six in the span of months. Always, the missing were last seen near the Copeland grounds. Always, their families spoke of dreams, dreams of being buried, of soil filling their lungs, of hearing a boy crying beneath the earth. Yet the authorities did nothing. Reverend Brant declared these tragedies the result of God's punishment for doubt. The sheriff, long in the Copeland's debt, refused to investigate. And the townsfolk, bound by fear, lowered their heads and endured. But endurance turned to sickness. Whole families began to waste away, their skin gray, their eyes sunken. Doctors could not explain it. Some claimed it was consumption. Others whispered it was grave air, a sickness born from Frederick's cursed burial. Lancaster became known as the dying town. Travelers avoided it. Maps omitted it. And within its decaying heart, the Copeland estate stood untouched, its shutters closed, its chapel candle burning night after night. The town was not just haunted, it was claimed. In 1891, 30 years after Frederick's burial, a seminarian named Thomas Ainsworth arrived in Lancaster to document the strange history of the town. He expected superstition. What he found was terror carved into every wall, whispered in every breath. The remaining townsfolk spoke in fragments, their words broken by fear. But one phrase appeared again and again. He was buried, but not taken. Ainsworth dug into church archives, bribing caretakers for access. There, he discovered a sealed box containing records of Frederick's funeral. Inside were scraps of Samuel's journal, Elias Dorn's confession, and an unholy litany penned by Reverend Brant himself. The litany described a ritual to bind a soul within its own decaying body, preventing its ascension. Brant claimed the ritual was necessary, that Frederick was a vessel unfit for God's kingdom. But Ainsworth saw it for what it was, a deliberate act of damnation. Frederick had not been allowed to die. He had been imprisoned in death. Ainsworth fled Lancaster within weeks, but not before recording his findings in a slim volume titled The Buried Voice. Few copies survived, and those that did were quietly burned by the church. But one passage remains, quoted in hushed tones. When you hear the scratching, it is already too late. For it does not come from the coffin. It comes from within you. By the turn of the century, the Copeland estate lay in ruin. Ivy devoured its walls. The windows sagged like open wounds. But those who dared to enter swore it was not empty. Some spoke of footsteps in the dust, of pews creaking though no one sat upon them. Others claimed the mirrors within the estate reflected not their own faces, but Frederick's pale and screaming visage. A group of boys, braving the house on a dare, swore they saw Samuel Copeland's body, long dead, yet still seated at his desk, pen in hand. His eyes were sockets, his mouth frozen midward. But beside him, in the faint candlelight, they saw a boy, thin, white-skinned, his fingers raw with soil. When they fled, one boy did not return. Days later, his body was found beneath the chapel floorboards, curled in the fetal position, his fingernails torn away. By then, Frederick Copeland was no longer remembered as victim or ghost. He was something else, an infection of memory, a punishment for betrayal. Those who entered the estate often left with dirt beneath their fingernails, though they swore they had touched nothing. Some coughed up soil. Others dreamed of suffocation until their hearts stopped in the night. Frederick had returned, not as brother, not as heir, but as the unending grave itself. By 1910, the Copeland estate had become a forbidden landmark. Children dared each other to touch the iron gates, but never entered. Those who lingered too long claimed they heard humming from the ground itself, a hymn no church had ever sung. Farmers plowing near the cemetery unearthed small bones, not animal, but unmistakably human. The church denied it, saying they were old burials from plague years. But the parents of missing children whispered otherwise. Some of those children were found weeks later, wandering fields in shock, their mouths filled with dirt. When asked where they had been, they only answered, "We were with Frederick. He sings under the ground." Doctors dismissed this as hysteria. But when these children later died, their fingernails bore the same marks, the splintered tearing of coffin wood. It was no longer one brother's torment. It had become a chorus of the buried. The church could no longer contain the infection. Priests who served Lancaster began to waste away. Their skin grew gray, their lips cracked, their sermons slurred into meaningless chants. Parishioners called it the ashen sickness. One priest, Father Keene, was found in the rectory, his Bible shredded, his throat packed with earth. On the walls, scratched by broken fingernails, were the words, "He breathes through us now." The diocese sent replacements, but none lasted more than a year. Records show priests begged to be transferred, claiming they heard voices beneath the altar. The bishop refused to close the parish, citing duty. But townsfolk began to suspect the truth. The church was not fighting Frederick. It was feeding him. In 1923, a fire consumed much of the Copeland estate. Witnesses claimed it began not in the kitchen, nor in the stables, but in the family chapel itself. Flames rose in spirals, unnatural, moving against the wind. Firefighters reported hearing screams from beneath the floorboards, screams that did not stop even after the chapel collapsed. When the embers cooled, investigators found no human remains, but the ground was riddled with hollow cavities, like tunnels clawed through by countless hands. Yet, even in ruin, the Copeland curse endured. Survivors of the fire fell ill within weeks, coughing dirt, their tongues blackened. Some swore they dreamed of Frederick standing in the ashes, untouched by flame, his eyes white, his nails grown long again. The fire should have ended the estate. Instead, it seemed to awaken something deeper. By the 1930s, Lancaster was nearly abandoned. Its population shrank to a fraction. Those who remained described the land itself as hollow. Barns collapsed without warning. The ground echoed beneath footsteps. Wells dropped into nothingness. Geologists who studied the area claimed the soil was riddled with sinkholes, as if something beneath had eaten away the earth. They left quickly, refusing to publish their findings. Locals knew better. They spoke of Frederick as less a ghost, more a force of hunger, not haunting the town, but devouring it from below. The orphanage closed after 3 children were found buried alive in shallow pits in the yard. Each bore fingernails stripped to raw bone. On the wall of their dormitory, scratched in desperate strokes, were the words, "Dig with us." In 1941, during preparations for wartime expansion, the federal government ordered sections of Lancaster's cemetery exhumed. What they found shocked even hardened officials. Dozens of graves contained not bones, but empty coffins, clawed apart from within. Others held bodies twisted in impossible contortions, mouths filled with soil, faces frozen in screams. At the center of the Copeland plot, Frederick's coffin was unearthed. But it was not empty. Inside lay a body, white, preserved, eyes open. His chest bore the unmistakable impression of nails digging outward. When exposed to light, the corpse crumbled into dust. But workers swore they heard whispers rising from the earth as the coffin was removed. One man collapsed on the spot, choking as his lungs filled with soil. The government sealed its reports. Lancaster was marked as unsuitable for development. But the men who worked that day never spoke freely again. Those who tried suffered choking fits in their sleep until they too were buried. Among the ruins of the Copeland house, investigators recovered fragments of Samuel's journal. Though many pages were destroyed, one remained intact. It read, "It was not the grave that trapped him. It was me. I bound him not in earth, but in blood. He will never forgive. He will never stop." The handwriting faltered, letters jagged and breaking apart. The last lines appeared almost carved into the paper. When you bury a voice, it does not go silent. It waits, and when it speaks again, it is not the voice you remember. Scholars who handled the journal reported nightmares for weeks. Some described hearing scratching sounds whenever they touched paper. A few claimed their own handwriting began to change, mirroring Samuel's jagged script. The journal was locked away in diocesan archives. But rumors say those who visit the vault hear faint sounds of nails across wood, echoing in the dark. In 1950, Lancaster was erased from most maps. The last census recorded fewer than 50 residents. Then, one night, the town simply vanished. Travelers reported reaching its borders only to find fields of churned earth, foundations swallowed, roads collapsing into caverns. No bodies were ever found. Witnesses swore they saw pale hands rising from the ground, hundreds of them, clawing at the surface before sinking again. The government declared it a geological disaster. But locals called it what it was, Frederick's final revenge. The brother who was buried alive had not remained in his coffin. He had dragged an entire town into the grave with him. What do we make of Frederick Copeland's story? Was it hysteria born of guilt, a family curse magnified by superstition? Or was it something older, proof that when a soul is denied rest, it finds another way to be heard? The Copeland tragedy was never recorded in schoolbooks. Lancaster itself was forgotten, erased, left off maps as though it had never existed. Yet fragments remain, in journals, in whispered hymns, in the dreams of those who dare to listen. And always, there is the scratching, that soft, steady sound at the edge of silence. Some say it's nothing more than the creak of wood, the shifting of earth. But others know better. For Frederick Copeland was not only buried alive, he was buried unheard. And voices denied will not vanish. They wait. Perhaps even now, beneath your feet, something claws upward. Perhaps the ground beneath you is thinner than you think. And perhaps, when you lie down tonight, you will dream of soil filling your mouth, of fingernails torn and bleeding, of a voice whispering from the dark, "Let me out."